Brad Gurley is the Director of Deliverability at What Counts, where amongst other tasks, he oversees the delivery of our application platforms and provides delivery strategies for that organization. Feel free to follow Brad on Twitter. Brad's handle is Delivery Counts. I'll now hand it over to Brad to begin the presentation.
All right, thanks so much, Victoria, and thanks everyone for joining us in our webinar today. Wanted to take some time to go through Deliverability 101. We want to talk to you about some of the basics of delivery, sort of the building blocks, if you will. We've done some more advanced webinars on delivery in the past where we talked about some very specific topics or maybe a specific season like the holiday season. But what we really wanted to do with this webinar is go back to the really kind of core ideas of what is deliverability, what are the things that make up deliverability, and what does all of that mean. So that's really what we wanted to give you guys some insight into today. And the very first question that, of course, we're going to ask is, what is deliverability? A very simple but very broad question. It's often looked at as a sort of black art that can only be practiced by a certain few people who have been through some special process or who have maybe had some training from some sort of master. But the idea of this series and of a lot of the blog posts and a lot of the education that we're doing is to really kind of break down some of those walls and to make deliverability something that everyone can understand. And of course, there are going to be more advanced topics in deliverability by all means, but really what we want to do is kind of disseminate some of that basic information so that you as marketers and senders can really kind of troubleshoot some issues and do some basic best practices and things that you want to do to make sure that you're getting the best possible delivery from your situation. Right. Now, to answer what is deliverability, you see that we've got a pretty blank screen here. And that's symbolic because I think when you ask a lot of people what is delivery, they go kind of blank there. They don't have an immediate answer for that. And then as you start to think, maybe you come up with some ideas. Well, what about preventing bounces? That seems like a good component of deliverability, absolutely. That certainly would be something I'd consider part of deliverability. Next thought might be avoiding the spam folder. I think that's what everybody wants to do. I want to make sure that the mail goes to the inbox instead of the spam folder. List hygiene, keeping your list clean, targeting, segmenting, that I think is a good component of deliverability as well. Opt-in management. That's always a great one, making sure that you're getting the best opt-in process possible, that you're really getting true permission from people, that you're managing their expectations, that you are compliant with all the laws. Now with the recent Canadian anti-spam law being something that's very specific about opt-ins, all of that certainly falls under deliverability. And then engagement. That's something that for a long time was not necessarily considered part of deliverability, but over the last few years, and specifically the last couple of years, that's been a big boost in the area of deliverability, that a lot of the ISPs are really moving towards an engagement-based model for at least some of their filtering. So the answer to all of these is yes. All of these things are deliverability and a lot more. I think all of these are components of deliverability. All of these things make up the discipline that we call deliverability, but it's really a very holistic view that we want to take on this, that there's not one area that you look at and say, well, deliverability is keeping mail out of the spam folder, or deliverability is making sure it doesn't bounce. It really is many things that we want to kind of encompass when we use that term, and that we really want to educate you on how you can kind of spot those things and ways that you may be able to improve your deliverability using all of these different methods here. One of the biggest kind of areas of confusion around deliverability is the one that we're going to take a look at here, and this is the delivered rate versus the inbox rate. So the chart that we've got on the right here is a little graph that came from our partner ReturnPath. They put out a report last year it's the ReturnPath Inbox Placement Benchmark Report 2014. So it was looking at mail traffic over the previous year, and basically I think it came out to about 500 million emails that were being tracked by ReturnPath because they have a huge presence in the industry. They are dealing with a lot of permission-based email senders, and this of course is all permission-based traffic. So these are all reputable senders. These aren't all of the senders in the world, because if we were to look at that volume, the vast majority of that volume would be spam, because there are so many people out there that are sending just buckets and buckets of unsolicited spam spam and junk mail and phishing and all those sorts of things. So this, doesn't take any of that into account. This is purely those, companies like yourself, marketers, organizations that are sending, permission-based email and that are sending to people that have requested that email in one way or another. So when we look at that, we see that there are a few different categories here. First, we've got the inbox category, then we've got the spam folder category, and then the missing. So when we look at our delivered rate, that's going to be the percentage of mail that's handed off to the intended server. So in this graph here, that's going to be the inbox plus the spam folder. So what that tells us is that, for the previous year, I think it was about mid-2013 to mid-2014, about 500 million or so emails, 89% of those got to the intended recipient. So 89% of those were delivered. So if you have an ESP, an email service provider, or a CRM software or something that's tracking your email, you'll see a delivery rate. And that's what you would see. If you're the average marketer, according to Return Path stats, you're going to be about 89% delivered. Now that still means that over 10% of your mail never made it to the recipient in any form. It didn't get to the spam folder. It just didn't get there at all. Certainly is concerning and is the reason that we want to educate people on deliverability. But it also highlights a little bit of a variation here between the delivered rate and the inbox rate, because as you can see, the inbox rate is only 83%. So while 89% actually got delivered and were handed off to the receiving server. So if we sent it to Brad@whatcounts.com, and whatcounts.com accepted that message and said, yes, I'll take it, but then sent it to my spam folder, it still got delivered, but it didn't get to the inbox. And one of the things that we know from industry experience and from seeing this, for many years now, is that the spam folder certainly doesn't, 100% prevent people from opening the email, but it absolutely discourages it. You're going to see much higher open rates in the inbox than you are in the spam folder because, of course, in the spam folder, you're competing with real spam emails and probably a very high volume of it if it's someone that's had their email address for any period of time. So the delivery rate versus the inbox rate is something that you always want to be mindful of. Most of the time, your, again, email service provider or your CRM software or whoever's helping you send your email can probably show you the delivery rate. They may not be able to show you the inbox rate. And at What Counts, we actually partner again with Return Path because they provide that data. And there are a couple of providers out there who provide that type of data so that you can see mail that made it to the inbox versus what got to the spam folder and versus what didn't show up at all. So the next natural question from that, once we've decided that 17% of permission-based email didn't make it to the inbox, is why does mail not reach the inbox? Because we know that these are permission-based emails. We know that these are reputable senders that are sending these emails. So what would prevent them from reaching the inbox? Why are they going to the spam folder, or why are they not showing up at all, for example? And there are a few reasons for that. The most common reasons really fall into these four categories. You would see there's an invalid user or domain. So either the username or the domain does not exist or it's been disabled. So that may be the portion before the @ sign or the portion after the @ sign doesn't exist. If you're sending to, for example, what if you sent to BARD@whatcounts.com and my address is Brad@whatcounts.com, then that's going to be an invalid address. It's probably going to bounce. But if you sent to Brad@wahtcounts.com, that domain doesn't exist at all. So you may not even get a notification on that. You may just get something back from your mail server that says, hey, this domain doesn't exist. We couldn't even find the domain. We couldn't find anybody to deliver that. So not to get too kind of in-depth and technical there, but the main kind of category reason here is that the user or the domain doesn't exist for whatever reason. If it's been disabled, a lot of times the ISPs, the internet service providers, will allow you to disable your mailbox for a period of time. In a lot of cases, that mail will either bounce or be rejected or whatever it might be. A poor reputation, that's going to be another one of the biggest causes for mail not getting to the inbox. Of course, this is if you're sending to someone who is a valid user or a valid address. What that typically means, just in a very kind of broad, simple statement, is that users have marked messages from either your IP address or your mail server or your domain as spam. So if you're sending from, again, let's say I'm sending mail from Brad@whatcounts.com and I've sent, hundreds and thousands of emails, and a lot of people have marked my messages as spam. then I'm going to have a poor reputation for my domain, whatcounts.com if I'm sending from that address, and also for my IP address, which is of course the mail server address that I'm sending from. So either of those things or a combination of both can cause you to have poor reputation. Specifically at Gmail, they measure domain reputation much more heavily than a lot of the other providers. So for Gmail and the Google Apps platform, which a lot of businesses are starting to use now, the domain is weighed, almost as heavily as the IP in those cases. Poor engagement, and again, this is something that's relatively new. It's something that has really grown in popularity over the past couple of years with the different mailbox providers. But what it basically means is that users aren't opening or engaging with your messages. And it also ties into reputation in another way, because there is sort of positive engagement and negative engagement. So positive engagement, of course, is opening your message, moving it into a folder, flagging it if they have an email client that allows that, replying to it, all of those positive things, putting you in their address book. Those are all considered positive engagement. But there are also negative engagement points as well, like marking the message as spam in their email client. Moving it into a junk folder, those sorts of things, ignoring it, not reading it at all is considered negative engagement. So basically you're looking at, you have poor positive engagement or high negative engagement is going to prevent your message from getting to the inbox. And that could also lead you to have a poor reputation. If you have a lot of people using the spam button, doing heavily negative engagement actions, then you may see your poor reputation as well. And then the last piece is spam-like content, and this is something that has also changed quite a bit over the last few years. I have been in the email marketing space for about 11 years now, and have seen a huge change in the way that content is filtered. In the early days, it was all kind of trigger words. If you have these very specific words or phrases in your email, then you are going to get marked as spam. And in a lot of cases, if you had more images than text, then you're going to get marked as spam. And those things are still around. They still have some weight in filtering, but it's much lower than what it used to be. And what it has kind of evolved into at this point is sort of fingerprinting, and that's what one of the major vendors out there uses. Their term is fingerprinting, but it's a good description, because what happens is each provider will take all of the mail that comes to them, and let's say they receive hundreds of millions of spam messages on a daily or monthly basis. They're going to take all of those messages that get marked as spam and sort of scan them in and look for commonalities between them. And your message, when it comes in, is going to be compared against sort of that composite spam message. So it's going to take a look at, okay, well, we got 100,000 spam messages today, and they had these characteristics in common. They compare your message against that. If your message has a lot of those characteristics, then it's much more likely to not make it to the inbox. Whereas if it has fewer of those, then it's more likely to make it to the inbox. So that's, I know it's a somewhat complex concept, but I think the main thing is there's still content filters in place. If you're sending something that's a very spammy industry, so to speak, if you're sending for pharmaceuticals, obviously everybody that's sending information about pharmaceuticals is not sending spam, and we know that, and everyone out there knows that. But there are some elements of that are very common in spam. So if you're selling certain types of pharmaceuticals, or if you're sending people to specific websites that are maybe common in spam, those are the types of elements that could cause your message not to go to spam, but not just because you're sending email about pharmaceuticals or any sort of product that may be in a high spam industry, we'll say. So the things that keep your mail from getting to the inbox do also happen with bounces. Some of those things will cause your mail to bounce, and some will cause it to go to the spam folder. So first we wanted to talk about what actually causes the bounces. So we talked about some of the things that keep your mail out of the inbox in general, but now we can talk a little more specifically about bounces. And of course, a bounce is anytime that a mail server rejects your message. So again, if I'm sending to brad@whatcounts.com and the server at whatcounts.com says, I don't want this message for whatever reason, I'm going to reject it. That's a bounce on the very basic level. And then beyond that, we go into the types of bounces that can occur. So there are really two main types of bounces. There are the soft bounces, which are the more transient or temporary types of bounces. Those are the things like a full mailbox, a temporary server error, these are the types of things that you'll see usually on a temporary basis. And you see here, this is an example of what a soft bounce message looks like. My apologies here, I had a little trouble. One moment. Okay, my apologies, everyone. My computer went a little wacky on me, so. Okay, so please accept apologies again, and we'll go back to here. So this is the message that you might see for soft bounce. In most cases, and this is not always, but the majority of cases, a soft bounce is going to start with a number 4 error code. Anytime that you send a message to a mail server, you're going to get a response code back from it. If the message is sent, without any problems, it's accepted, everything's good, you'll get a 250 code back. And 250 is the, 250 OK. It's a very common lingo for people in the email industry. But the 250 is an error code that says, yes, the message is accepted, everything's good, no problems there. A code that starts with a 4, again, in most cases indicates a temporary or soft bounce. In this case, you can see it's a 422, but it could be a 421 or a 450 or 442, or there's any number of different codes that different servers may return. But usually those are going to start with a 4, and then there will be probably some detail after that code letting you know the specific issue. So in this case, you can see it's mailbox full, quota exceeded. So that's a pretty common one. I don't think it's as common as it was a few years ago, because a lot of the free mail providers, the Gmail and Outlook.com and all those, have such large storage capacity that it's not as common to have a full inbox. But we still have lots of people using desktop Outlook and using some of the ISP mailboxes like your Comcast and Verizon that have a more finite limit on the amount of mail that you can save. So it's certainly still something we see pretty often is a mailbox full or quota exceeded type message. Server errors are usually a little more transient. It's, let's say, for example, if Yahoo has one of their mail servers down right now, I would say for the day, but usually somebody like Yahoo doesn't go down for an entire day, but they might go down for an hour. They may have a couple of mail servers that go out for an hour. So you might see an error that says, server error, please try again. And the last one that I mentioned here was deferrals, and again, Yahoo is actually pretty well known for this, that if you're sending too many emails to them within a certain period of time based on your reputation or just based on the overall traffic, then they'll return to you a deferral and say, hey, we can't deliver this message right now, but you should try again in a little while. And that's the kind of the core functionality of most soft bounces, is that if you get back a soft bounce, most systems, again, if you're working with an email service provider or CRM, any kind of mail transfer agent, you're probably going to have it set up so that it's going to retry delivery to any of those soft bounces for up to 48 hours or until a permanent message is returned that says, hey, stop trying this. That's where the hard bounces come into play. So a hard bounce is a more permanent type error, more of an invalid user type error. As we mentioned here, you see the code, the 511 user unknown. That's a relatively common one that we see. 550 a lot of times means a block. A 571, again, usually it starts with a 5. And we'll have a couple of digits after that, and then some text letting you know what might have happened there. So again, this one's fairly self-explanatory. The user is unknown. They don't have a user by that name on that server. So an invalid address, of course, is that. Inactive user account. So again, if you have one of the ISPs like Comcast or Verizon or Roadrunner or somebody like that, you may have the ability to disable your account, or maybe let's say you didn't pay your internet bill and your account got disabled without so much of a choice there. In those cases, the account would be inactive, but a lot of times those do return hard bounces saying, this account's not active, to stop sending to it. And then the last one is rejections. And again, that's a sort of a broad term, kind of like deferrals, but because there are many reasons that rejections can occur, and some of those are, content-based or spam filter-based, and a lot of those are around blocks and blacklists. So those are a couple things we're going to talk about in just a minute. But with a hard bounce, typically, your server is not going to retry those in most cases. And most ESPs or most CRM softwares will not continue trying to deliver to a hard bounced address, and that's with good reason, because it really, in most cases, with a few exceptions, if you have a block in place, you shouldn't be continuing to send to hard bounced addresses, because there are actually many providers out there that will track how many times you're hitting hard bounced addresses, and will throw up blocks because of that, or prevent mail from getting delivered to them because you've sent to too many of those hard bounce addresses, either during a limited period of time. I actually worked with a client not too long ago that had an issue with Verizon because of that. They had sent too many hard bounces during a day. They were migrating over a list from a different source, and the hard bounces were not cleaned out properly, I guess, in that process. So they hit too many hard bounces in one day with Verizon, and they saw a block because of that. And we were able to work with Verizon, get that corrected, and work with the client to make sure that they weren't continuing to hit those hard bounces. But we did get them out of their list and halted sending to them. Excuse me. But that is something that can cause blocks, and you really want to be mindful of that. One of the biggest things that causes rejections, as I mentioned, are spam filters. I think the spam filter is something that is not uniform. Every single provider is probably going to have a different spam filter in place. If you go to either an ISP or a mailbox provider like a Gmail or an Outlook or Yahoo or AOL or whoever it might be, they're all going to have spam filters in place internally. And in addition, some of them will also use external spam filters. So there are companies out there that are third-party vendors, like a Spam House is actually a very major one that can cause some big problems if you were to ever to get listed on those guys. Spam Cop is a pretty well-known one as well. Services like CloudMark, Symantec has an antivirus software. Symantec, formerly Norton, they have an antivirus software that they sell out third-party to people. Barracuda is one of the services that sell out. So you've probably heard all of those names in one form or another. Hopefully you haven't heard them because you were trying to get delisted by them. But the point there is that there are so many different types of spam filters out there, both direct at the ISPs and the ones that are hosted by a third party and are kind of used by some ISPs, that we want to talk a little bit about how those work and what are the commonalities between those. So the biggest thing to remember again is that even though that all of the spam filters are very, very different, they all have very varying criteria for what they use to determine if a message is spam or to figure out how to route a message. They do have some common factors in play. So in pretty much all spam filters, it's going to be some combination of these three elements. Maybe one filter weighs reputation very heavily, but content not very heavily, or a lot of filters will weigh reputation or content heavily, but not engagement. So there are different concentrations of each of these areas, but in most cases it's going to be a combination of these three elements that lead to the decision that a spam filter makes. So when you send a message to, again, if you send a message to what counts, we probably will have our own spam filters in place based on what we're using. So let's say we're using Google Apps to provide our email service. Then we're going to have Google's filters that are going to do some kind of top-level, filtering for us and determine, hey, okay, based on these factors, we think the mail can get through. And then we'll probably have some additional filters. We may subscribe to a third-party service, like a Barracuda or a CloudMark that runs, on top of that. So once Google has passed their checks, then we've got another set of checks that are running through that are using different criteria. So, these factors, when you look at reputation, does your IP address or your domain frequently show up in spam messages? And again, these are kind of very simple questions that summarize these points, but I think they definitely get the point across. If you're having a reputation issues, then the problem is that your domain or your IP address is in messages that people are marking as spam. That's going to be the primary issue, and there are certainly some lesser weighted delivery issues or reputation issues that you can have if you've just opened a brand new domain that hasn't been established for very long. That can have a reputation issue just because it's unknown. Same thing with IP address. If you've just started sending from a new IP address, it doesn't have a history with the ISP, so it can have a poor reputation, or at least a neutral reputation, until you've started really building up that traffic and establishing a good reputation on that. So, those are a couple of exceptions where you may have a reputation issue, but it's not because you've been seen in spam messages or been advertised through spam messages. But in most cases, that's the issue, is that people are hitting the "this is spam" button, or you may be hitting spam traps, and that's something, again, we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But spam trap addresses that, that don't sign up for email, but if you're sending mail to them, then that's another sign to these receivers that you're sending a message that's not solicited or not permission-based. So, the biggest thing you can do from a reputation standpoint is just to be sure that you are, sending email that people want, that you're getting clear permission, that you're setting the proper expectations on the front end when someone requests an email, that they know, what they're going to be receiving, how often they're going to be receiving it, and that you, stick to those expectations. And that's going to make sure that your messages are, well received. People don't mark them as spam. You're not sending the spam traps if you're getting permission. So all of those things are really going to tie back into reputation. Content, we talked about it a little bit already, and you'll see, some of these concepts, they do repeat in different areas and different points that we're talking about, because these are really the functionalities of deliverability. These are kind of the functional aspects, of deliverability. Is your content similar to other messages marked as spam? Again, that's something that can include not only the content, to the point of editorial content, or your newsletter, or articles, or your sales pitch, or your products. Those things certainly all contribute to that. But one of the things that people don't always consider is the URLs in your message. So if you are using, for example, a URL shortener like a bit.ly, or the t.co shortener that Twitter uses, for example, those types of URL shorteners often will get your message flagged, because the reason that those happen, or that happens, is that a lot of spammers will use those to mask the address that they're sending you to. So it may even be a phishing message that's purporting to be from Bank of America, and the link goes to I'm trying to steal your money.com, and they don't want you to see that, so they send you instead to bit.ly / some string of characters. So you think, okay, well, it's just a URL shortener. I'm going to click on it, and you don't realize that you're going to, I'm going to steal your money.com until you're already there. So that's the reason that, the URLs can trigger spam filtering as well. Not just URL shorteners, though. Even if your message, let's say, for example, that, again, we'll use What Counts as the example here. Let's say we were to pay some, third-party company and say, hey, we want you to send out emails advertising What Counts, pushing people to the whatcounts.com website. And we pay this company, and then they decide, hey, we're just going to scrape email addresses from everywhere and send them email, to try and get them to whatcounts.com, because we want to get paid, for advertising and for getting, for driving traffic to What Counts. Well, what happens is, because so many of those messages that get marked as spam, even though they didn't come directly from What Counts, even though we may not have had anything to do with their sending or the way they were sent, because they're pointing people to whatcounts.com, and that's in the content of the message. If enough people mark that as spam, then our legitimate email from whatcounts.com could be affected as well, because that becomes a content filter that AOL or Verizon or whoever says, hey, we've seen 10,000 messages with whatcounts.com in the body that were marked as spam this week. We're going to flag anything that's coming in from them and block it. So that's where content filtering is a lot more intricate than it used to be. Then again, looking for common words and phrases, but making sure that your domain and your reputation and your content is not something that's being pushed by less than reputable advertisers. So if you're contracting people to advertise your product or your business or your organization, make sure that they're using good practices, or that could harm your legitimate attempts as well. And then the last piece, of course, is engagement, and that's something that I'm sure if you've done any reading on deliverability, if you've talked to anyone about deliverability over the last couple of years, this is something that you've heard quite a bit. The engagement really was kind of spearheaded by Gmail. They were the first to start really measuring engagement and measuring, how people are treating emails. Are they engaging positively or negatively? What are they doing once the message comes in? And really using that to filter mail. And now it's trickled into a lot of the other providers as well. We know that AOL uses it. We know that Yahoo uses it, at least to some degree. They haven't, most of the ISPs won't specify exactly, how they use it or how deep it is involved. We know with Gmail it's a very, very heavy indicator of how your message gets delivered. With AOL and Yahoo, it's a little more nebulous. At Hotmail, they use it on an individual level, so if somebody has interacted with your messages in the past, then that person will probably continue to get those messages. If that person has never interacted with your messages, then they probably will not get your messages in the inbox. So these are things that you want to try and foster. With reputation and content, of course, it's just making sure that you're doing the right things, making sure that your content is compliant, that your advertisers are doing the right things. But with engagement, that really brings sort of a new element into things. And engagement is something that you want to do not only from a delivery standpoint, but just from a business standpoint. If you're running a business or even just an organization that you want people to be engaged with and to interact, that's going to benefit you in all aspects, and not just deliverability, but it is becoming more and more crucial to your deliverability that people are engaging. So, you can't do what a lot of people like to call batch and blast. I know that's still a fairly widely used term, but was something that was very, very common a few years ago. Was you take however many addresses you've got, and you just send them all the same message, and you send it to them however many times you are determined to do that. And that's something that is kind of going away because of a lot of these types of filters that you need to see, okay, what are people actually requesting? What are they interested in? Are they engaging with product type emails? Are they engaging with newsletter type emails? All of these pieces are really kind of beginning to blur the line between the delivery aspect and almost the strategy aspect as well, because these things will benefit you on both sides of that coin. If you're looking at these different factors and how they affect mail delivery, in most cases, reputation is the most likely to get your message just completely blocked. So there's the blocking or the missing, as we saw in the return path graph earlier, and then there's the spam folder. And of course, you ideally don't want either. You'd probably rather have spam folder than missing if you have to choose one, but neither is good. But in most cases, you're most likely to get blocked because of reputation. So you're most likely to have your mail just get completely rejected for reputation. Content and engagement are more likely to send you to the spam folder instead of getting you blocked. Although I've certainly seen people that their engagement was bad enough that they got blocked. Although usually it's reputation that's going to do that. There are a number of tools available to check your reputation as a sender. You can check your IP address reputation. You can check your domain reputation. All of these things are out there. Of course, Return Path, as I mentioned, is a partner of ours that provides the sender score, which is a pretty widely known reputation-based metric for IP addresses. That's at senderscore.org if you want to go and kind of check it out and do a quick check of what your IP reputation might be. That's one of the definitely the most well-known out there. There are other ones out there that check your domain reputation, check if you're on different blacklists and those sorts of things. So, won't get into too much detail on those because there are, many of those out there. But there are a lot of resources for that. And, if you have questions about that, offline, we'd be happy to give you some recommendations there. For content, there are also tools out there, of course, because the content is a little more fluid in that, it's comparing it to messages that are out there. It's in more real time. It may not be quite as easy to track down a content issue, but certainly is still available. I know Litmus is one of the big content testing tools out there, and they have a lot more than just purely content testing, but they do a lot of different tests out there for things like broken links in your message and different elements of your message that could cause problems. So they're not the only tool available, but again, kind of one of the most well-known that maybe you've heard of and you may want to look into. With engagement, there's not really a tool that you can use for that. That's something that you have to look at the metrics that you have either from your email provider or your CRM or whatever you're using to send your email. Look at your opens, look at the people who are purchasing, the people who are clicking. Most of the ISPs or the mailbox providers out there, they don't have information on who clicked, or they don't look at information on who clicked. They don't look at information on who purchased something. But that's just because they, for the clicks, it's privacy, and for the purchases, they don't really have that data. So they're using different data as if, are people moving your message into a folder? Are they replying to you? These different types of metrics there. But the best way to kind of approximate those is to look at the data that you do have. So if people are opening, if they're clicking, if they purchase things, then those are the people that are engaged. And you can see that they're engaged, and they're the ones that are also going to be moving your messages into folders on their email client, that are going to be replying to you, that are going to be doing all of these different things that are indicating engagement to the ISPs and the mailbox providers as well, and not just from what you're seeing in your in your email metrics. We talked a little bit about the third-party providers that are out there, and I wanted to touch very briefly on two things that are very similar and often get confused, but are quite a bit different, and these are Blacklist and Blocklist. And these two types of lists are similar, but they have different purposes. A blacklist is IP address based, so this is the mail server that you're sending your mail from. That's what's going to be caught by a blacklist. So these are typically operated by third parties. Actually, both of these usually are. But an ISP or a mailbox provider may subscribe to one of these blacklists. Again, like Spamhaus as an example, they're probably the biggest one out there. If Spamhaus gets spam reports from your IP address, or you hit one of their spam trap addresses, then they're going to list you. If you hit a number, usually not just one, but then they're going to flag you and say, hey, this IP address is doing some things that we don't like. And then every ISP that subscribes to that blacklist is going to block you, is going to block your mail, and that would be for the case of Spamhaus is going to be most of the major providers. With blacklists, usually there are two different ways that they can process you. There are some that will automatically remove your IP address if they don't see any negative activity. So Spam Cop is a good example of that. If they don't see any activity for 24 hours or 48 hours, or depending on your reputation, they'll automatically remove your IP address. Although there are some that require you to actually reach out to them and say, hey, what can we do to be removed? And that's something that if you're in that situation, there are some that are easier to deal with, but some that just have kind of a simple form to fill out. But in most cases, the blacklist operators can be a little difficult to navigate. So if you have an email provider or someone who's working on that with you, or delivery consulting, it may be best to enlist someone like that to help in those cases, because it certainly can be a little bit tricky at times. And then the alternative to that is a block list. And again, the words are almost identical, but a block list is a little bit different in that it usually indicates a domain or URL-based list. So this is something like a provider list that will, I think Serval is one of these, SURVL is a domain-based list. But what I mentioned a little bit earlier about messages or URLs that are found in a lot of spam messages. So if there are tons of spam messages out there that are advertising go to whatcounts.com, no matter where they came from, no matter who sent them, if there are enough of them out there and they get enough of those reports or they hit enough spam traps, then they're going to block any message that includes that domain or that URL in it. So that's why it's always good to be very mindful of the URLs that you're linking to, both your own and if you're linking to any kind of third-party URL in your message, you may want to do some test runs to make sure that specific domain or URL isn't seeing any delivery issues there. And as I noted here, that can flag any domain in the message. It could be the from address. So if you're sending from brad@whatcounts.com, it could just be in the text of the message linking to whatcounts.com. Any type of domain or URL that's in the body of that message or even in the headers could be on one of these block lists. And just like the blacklist, there are some that will remove you automatically if they don't see any negative activity. With the block list, I'd say there aren't a lot of those, but there are a couple that do that. A couple of the well-known ones do that, but then there are others that also require you to reach out to ask them to delist you. And as I mentioned, to get on a block list or a blacklist, or even just to get blocked by an ISP, one of the things that you do is you hit spam traps. And that's one of the things that can cause reputation issues. But, when you're dealing with spam traps, what are they and where do they come from? Admiral Akbar wants to know, and I think we all want to know a little bit about that. So there are really kind of three main types of spam traps, and these certainly are not all that's out there. There are others that are available or that are out there, but these are really the three types that most people are going to run into. There are the pristine traps. These have had no valid activity ever. They don't sign up for anything. They don't submit forms. They don't do anything because they were created solely to catch people who are grabbing addresses off of websites or forum signatures or that sort of thing. So these may even be prominently placed on certain websites just to try and kind of bait these spammers into scraping the addresses off and sending to them. So these are the types of addresses that if you're getting permission, if you've got a sign-up form, if you've got any way that someone is actually requesting email from you, you're very rarely, if ever, going to hit one of these pristine traps. These are very uncommon for legitimate marketers. Usually if you hit one of these, you're going to be one of more of the hardcore spammers. It's not to say that's always the case, and it certainly isn't. I mean, we've seen cases where legitimate marketers got one of these in their list through some form or another. It may have been that they weren't following best practices. It may have been some other confluence of circumstances. But in most cases, if you're sending permission-based email, you're not going to hit a pristine trap. Recycled traps. These are the ones that we probably see the most, although the typo traps are really kind of growing in popularity as well. But a recycled trap is one that a lot of marketers run into, and this is an address that was valid at some point in the past. They may have signed up for your emails. They may have purchased something from your website. They may have purchased dozens of things from your website. But at some point or another, that address went cold. So, maybe they had a Yahoo address, for example, and they decided, hey, I'm getting a Gmail address, and they just stopped using Yahoo. They either canceled their account or they just left it, dormant for a period of time, and then Yahoo, automatically shut it, as most of the free mail providers will do. They'll kind of close down an account if it stays dormant for a period of time. And then after that period of time goes by, and usually it's going to be 6 to 12 months at a minimum that an address would be dormant. In most cases, they're going to return a hard bounce during that time. So anybody who's really kind of monitoring these things should be removing those addresses during that time. But then after that period, they will turn that address back on and say, hey, now anybody that's still mailing this is not following best practices and they're not cleaning their list. They don't have good list hygiene. So these are much more common. We see these from a lot of senders. They are avoided by targeting your engaged users, minimizing the volume to inactive users, or cleaning them out. If you've got people who just are not engaging at all with your emails, they haven't opened anything in a year or 2 years or whatever it might be. You've tried to re-engage them, they're just not responding. Those are the ones that we recommend getting rid of. Outside of that, trying re-engagement campaigns, trying to reduce the frequency that you're sending to these people. That's going to help to minimize those recycled trap hits. And of course, anytime that you have a hard bounce, you want to remove it. And that's the case where you may run into problems if you have a list that you don't send to for a while. So let's say you have a list of people that you send to for a few months, and then for whatever reason they don't get any emails for 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 months. And then you decide, well, I want to start sending to these people again. That's when you run a higher risk of hitting those recycled traps, because during those months when those people weren't receiving emails, their address may have been invalid, it may have been hard bouncing, and they didn't, you don't know it because you weren't actually sending traffic during that time. So, that's another, recommended way to try to avoid these, is to make sure that you're sending traffic to everyone at least somewhat consistently. Even if you don't have, if you're a seasonal, vendor or company or organization, try to think of some other, way to engage people throughout the year, even if it's not your peak season, or even if it's not the, the ideal time that you really either do your business or get your donations or whatever it might be. And then the typo traps, and these are a newer type of trap. They've actually been around for a very long time, but they've really come into popularity over the last few years. There was a big issue with these. I want to say it was about 4 years ago around the holidays. These are mistyped versions of popular domains, so misspelled Yahoo, misspelled Gmail, gmail.com, all of those things, and they're designed to catch senders who aren't validating subscriber addresses. So really the best way to completely avoid these is through double opt-in. And this was actually the big issue that was a few years ago was from Spam House, who are very adamant supporters of double opt-in. We being in the email service provider space, don't require double opt-in, and we know that there are cases where you can get a perfectly clean list by not double opting in. Of course, double opt-in is sort of the gold standard. It's going to give you the best possible list. But there are trade-offs, of course. You're going to have a smaller list most likely by doing that, but there are a number of factors that come into play there. So, one thing that we say, if you can't use double opt-in, or if you have certain types of traffic that's coming in, if you're getting signups from a point of sale, if you're getting someone at a register to write down an email address or type in an email address, you really should be double opting in that address, or at least sending them a confirmation, because there's so much room for manual error there. If you've got somebody getting email addresses over the phone, you really should be confirming that. Those are where you really run the risk of those. Certainly, letting someone type in their own address, they're still going to misspell it sometimes, but it's not nearly as much of a risk as when you're dealing with like a point of sale type entry. So. One thing to note about spam traps is that most of them will accept all mail. So most of them don't bounce a message once they're turned back on, so to speak. They accept all mail. There are some that will bounce messages, and that's why it's really important to make sure that you do remove those hard bounces, when they occur, because you don't want to continue sending if they are trap emails, or if they're messages or emails that maybe will get reactivated as traps in the future. And then the last big question that we have is, when should I care about deliverability? Because I hear this a lot of times from people, maybe phrased a little differently, but I'm getting good open rates. I'm not seeing any issues. All of my tests seem fine. I haven't heard any complaints. I don't need to worry about deliverability. Well, I think to answer that question, I'm going to borrow a phrase from a gentleman by the name of Morrissey, and say, how soon is now? And that's really when you should be worried about deliverability, or at least concerned about deliverability, not so much worried. But that's something that you really should be monitoring on a regular basis. Even if you don't think you have an issue, there's always some room for improvement there. And the example that I'll use to kind of close things out on my side is, we had a client who's a digital publication network who didn't think they had any issues. They had pretty decent open rates. Offhand, I'd say I believe they were somewhere around the 10–15% open rate. They were happy with that. They saw decent engagement. They were seeing money come in. Of course, they saw good revenue from the email. But when we really dug in and started looking at their delivery, they had pretty much no inbox at Gmail, according to the seed testing. And their Hotmail was fluctuating anywhere from pretty much all spam to about 50–50. And that is certainly not ideal. So, just by, kind of getting into that, looking at that, starting to, clean up their list a little bit, look at the expectations they were setting with people, they saw a 15 percentage point increase in their open rates by doing that, even though, again, they already had pretty solid open rates. They were happy with their open rates, but they saw a very big increase in that just by, paying attention to those things. And and really kind of watching their deliverability. In some cases, that might involve bringing in an outside consultant, bringing in your ESP, your CRM, whoever it might be, or it may even just be watching those metrics on your own. Are you seeing, in your testing, are you seeing issues? There's a lot of different ways to do that. There are kind of do-it-yourself tools out there. There are consulting, options out there. We have consulting as part of our service if you're a accounts client. If we don't, there are obviously lots of other options available as well. So there are lots of different ways to kind of get hold of your deliverability. Hopefully this presentation has given you some ways that you can start looking at things on your own, some best practices that you can follow, and some things that you can keep an eye on, and things to really understand a little more about how your email program is working and how the deliverability is looking, I guess you'd say. With that said, I think at this point I would kind of open it up and hand off to you guys for any questions that you may have. And I don't know, Victoria, I can check out the chat here and see if we've got any open questions.
Yeah, we got a ton of good questions throughout the presentation. So I'm not sure if you can see them, Brad, but I can ask a few of what we've seen coming in here. So one of the ones we've gotten for Blacklist, is it just the IP address, or is it also the ESP email delivery tool that you're using that can affect being on a blacklist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great question. And yes, actually, both of those are true. So when you're looking at an IP address or a domain, obviously, if you're using a specific email provider, their IP addresses may be on a blacklist, or their domain may be on a blacklist of some sorts, and that could have an impact on your deliverability, absolutely. So in most cases, depending on the provider, if you have a dedicated IP address that's assigned, just to you, then that would indicate that, any IP address issues that you're having are probably your own, and are not, linked to the provider, unless there's a very, very large issue where, somebody has blocked an entire range of IP addresses, which is very uncommon, but certainly does happen. So that's, in those cases, you're probably, still seeing an issue that's specific to you and your IP address, but there could be a domain issue. So if you have, a specific domain that you're sending from that is tied into your email service provider, and that domain, for whatever reason, is, blocked or something like that, then yes, you absolutely could see issues. The other thing, when you're looking at IP addresses, is if you're sending from a shared IP address pool. So if you're sending, you don't have your own dedicated IP address, and you have, maybe relatively low volume, and you're sharing an IP address pool with a number of other senders who are using the same ESP, then in that case, yes, absolutely. If one or more of those IP addresses is blocked, it could be something that you did. It could be something that, one of the other senders that's on that pool did that got the IP address blocked. But in most cases, and I'll say most ESPs, email service providers, are very good about monitoring that and getting those issues resolved. But certainly, if you see such an issue at your ESP, if it's what counts, if it's not what counts, whoever it is, bring it up to them and make them aware of it. And again, in most cases, all the ESPs I've ever worked with directly have been very good about resolving those issues.
Definitely. And then kind of going off of that, we got a question. Now this relates, they asked it specifically in relation to Gmail, but probably could be for anything. What is your suggestion for Gmail delivery, IP pool or one IP only?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in most cases, depending on your volume, is going to be more of the delineating factor there. There's a couple of different things that come into play. So it's not just for Gmail. I think the recommendation that I make would tie into all providers and not just Gmail, but it would apply to Gmail as well, is that if you have enough volume to support it, and in most cases what we mean by that is you're sending probably anywhere around 100 to 150,000 emails a week consistently, then you probably have the volume to really support a dedicated IP and support it well. Then in that case, I recommend a dedicated IP, because you want to make sure that your IP address is really the one that is, your content is really what's determining the reputation of that IP address, your sending patterns, your engagement. Now, of course, that can be an issue if you're not following best practices. So, if you're not, getting good permission or setting good expectations, then that could also harm you. But the idea is that what you really want to do is to be on a dedicated IP and to make sure that you're following those best practices, and that's going to give you the best possible deliverability, because you're not diluting it with, traffic from other senders and that sort of thing. If you have very low volume, and it's not transactional, I kind of caveat it with that, then you probably are best to be on a shared pool, because you do need some volume from other senders to try and bring up the, to really kind of establish that reputation with the different ISPs. At Gmail, because the domain is a little more important to Gmail than it is to the other providers, it doesn't have as big of an impact that you're on a shared IP, because Gmail looks at the combination of IP and domain. So, I've seen two branches of the same client. It's a retailer. They have, two different kind of store brands. Both of them are sending from the same IP addresses, but they use different from domains. One of them was getting near perfect delivery at Gmail. The other brand was getting, almost a full, bulk folder at Gmail at the same time. So even though they were sending from the same IP addresses, they were using different from domains and different domains in their messages, and Gmail was able to differentiate between those two. So there is a little more of a buffer there when you're using a shared IP with Gmail if you have a different domain than the other senders that are on that IP.
Great. And then kind of taking a different direction, are there any appropriate or legally appropriate steps to re-engage recipients who might have unsubscribed in the past?
That's a great question, and one that I've heard quite a bit over the years, honestly. Not through email. There is not, if someone has unsubscribed from email, then, any additional emails that you send them are in violation of canned spam if you're in the U.S. And outside the U.S. there are similar laws in place in a number of countries. So, once someone has unsubscribed, sending them any kind of email other than just a straight transactional, your order is shipped, or thanks for your purchase. Those types of things would be a violation. I've worked with people who maybe sent postal mail to those people, so maybe it was a retailer that had their physical address on file. They've sent postal mail to them, they've reached out to them by phone. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that, but once someone is unsubscribed from your mailings, any additional emails that you send to them are not a good idea at that point and are in violation.
Great. Another question, I'll try and ask about 2 or 3 more, and people drop off, that's all right. Is a hard bounce only an invalid email address or an invalid domain, or are there other reasons for a hard bounce?
Mm-hmm. Hard bounces can be caused by a couple of different things. So the invalid address and invalid domain are the biggest causes for hard bounces. There are also some hard bounces that can be caused by blocks. So, rejections, what I mentioned when we talked about the hard bounces earlier. So, let's say, for example, that Verizon has blocked your email. You've gotten too many spam complaints, and they don't want to allow any more email through. They actually return a hard bounce, which is a 571. The one that Verizon returns is 5.7.1 hard bounce that says, you're blocked. Don't send us any more email, or something like that. So, yes, you can actually have hard bounces caused by a mail block. At least at What Counts and the other ESPs that I've worked with before, there are filters in place to kind of catch those. So, if you're looking at an ESP or something similar, there's probably going to be a filter that will say, even though this is technically a 500 level bounce, it's actually due to a block, so we shouldn't be removing this person because the address is valid. It's just a block is temporarily in place, and once we resolve that, then we should be able to reach them successfully.
Awesome. And then is reputation proportionate to the size of the list you're sending to, or is it just the number of times you're flagged?
The reputation is all over the map, to be honest with you. Every different provider is going to measure it a little bit differently. If you're sending 10 emails a day to Gmail, for example, and one of those gets flagged as spam, you're probably going to have a problem because even though you're sending very low volume, you've still got a very high spam complaint rate. So that's something that is important to look at, and I know I use a kind of extreme example just to demonstrate the point, but that's why I mentioned a little bit earlier, to send from a dedicated IP address, you really need to have enough volume to support it, and that's one of the big reasons why is that if you've got a very low volume going to a specific ISP in a given day, even just a handful of spam complaints or a spam trap hit can completely derail your deliverability for that ISP or for that provider. So it does scale based on volume to some degree. Certainly as you get in higher volumes, it will kind of adjust, and there's an economy of scale there. But again, how much it adjusts depends on what provider you're dealing with, and there are some providers out there that will flag you for X number of spam trap hits or complaints no matter how much volume you send. Those aren't the majority, but there are a couple that are out there. So even if you send 1 million emails, if you get 500 spam complaints, you're done for that day. So that's something that is certainly less common but does exist out there.
Awesome.